Now, Gough Whitlam came to Trinity while I was there, and to talk about you-know-what. So that was to a history class. Let me tell you, it wasn't history, but there we go. And I was asked to have him in our study for afternoon tea. So my secretary prepared a nice afternoon tea. Very grand structure it was. One of the previous headmasters had it as his C cabins. He called it marvellous office, very grand. So I had a stack of books for Gough to sign, which he did. And eventually he said, "What's your background?" "Oh," I said, "I'm a refugee." "Are you?" So I said, "Yes." What happened in 1940 with the Japanese going through the Far East? My father decided that his family would be far safer in Australia, where his mother had been born. She's Tasmanian. So we were sent down here, and sure enough the Japanese did attack the next year. And so my father's house was demolished by a British shell during the battle for Hong Kong, only brief but fairly deadly. And if Dad hadn't sent us down to Australia, I wouldn't be talking to you today. And Patricia would not be Patricia Braga, she might still be Patricia Young. But there we go. So there is part of the providence of God, that he brought us to Australia, and the rest is really a story of thy hand, O God, has guided thy flock from age to age. And I won't sing the hymn, you'd all run for the exits. Doug, now I'm going to look this morning at, say, four things. What is a convention? How did this convention begin? In its long existence, how has it changed? And then lastly, I might touch effectively and with a certain amount of diffidence on the last question, how effective has it been? So, see if this works. It was founded, of course, as you see, in 1903. And that is not an old picture, it's obviously very recent. But the motto is old. The motto, in fact, is original. And it goes back before the Katoomba Convention, back to the beginnings of Christian conventions as such. Now, why were there ever conventions? Let's go right back. Now, there's a face you're all familiar with. And when Sir Marcus was asked on the 90th anniversary in 1993 what he would like to speak about, unhesitatingly he said, personal holiness, because that has been the abiding theme of Christian belief and practice throughout many ages. And you can go right back to, monasticism was about a search for holiness. The Essenes, right at the beginning, a search for holiness, come through to the 18th century. John Law, a serious call to a devout and holy life. You might think they're a very, very somber book. In fact, it's never been out of print. I've discovered several editions still in print now. Go back a bit, St. Ignatius Loyola, founder of the Jesuits, saw himself as a Christian soldier, and his book on spiritual exercises was really an attempt at personal holiness. It remains to this day one of the foundation textbooks for students in Jesuit colleges, that is, postulates for the order. Come forward to the late 19th century. The rise of railways, the rise of a middle class of fairly well-to-do people with leisure time, the beginning of holidays, not just an August bank holiday, Christmas and Easter and Good Friday, but a week's holiday, and the ability to leave the smoky cities of England, and a couple of local people, the rector of Keswick and the local squire, decided that they wanted to hold a convention for the deepening of the spiritual life. That's the phrase they used, the deepening of the spiritual life, so they did. That tent obviously was not erected in 1875, but this looks to be about the beginning of the 20th century. And the Keswick Convention began with a week, people all came by railway, to the mountains and the lovely lakes of the Lakes District in northern England. And the mountains and the lakes were an essential part of the Keswick experience, as they were in Katoomba, not the lakes there, but the mountains, lifting their eyes to the hills, walking beside the still waters, and the Lord restores my soul. Almost immediately, somebody had the bright idea of a convention in Australia. Now, the Reverend H.B. McCartney was an outstanding Christian leader in Melbourne for something like 30 years, and he decided he would hold a convention. He heard about Katoomba, he heard about Keswick, he thought this would be a very good idea. Went extremely well, but then he went on to other things, and the idea of a convention lapsed in Australia for many years, until two visits, this is the second one, 1893, of the Reverend George Grugg and a mission team which had an enormous impact. Evangelicalism in Australia, especially in Melbourne for a time, and then continuing in Sydney, became a very, very powerful force. Grugg preached quietly and simply from the Bible. He was a Bible exponent, an expositor, and it made a permanent impact upon Australian Christianity. There are a couple of books emerging from it. Mrs. Millard, who's the lady there, wrote the second one. And there's a marvellous image she gives. Walking down George Street, she met a man who had a saved-looking face. So she stopped and had a chat. And sure enough, he was a saved man. And I asked myself the question as I read this: do I have a saved-looking face? Do you have a saved-looking face? People who were blessed by the Grub Mission had saved-looking faces. Another great Christian leader who visited Australia was Hudson Taylor, the founder of the China Inland Mission. Quiet little man. He came to Australia, not first class, didn't stay 5-star anywhere, stars hadn't been invented then. To reduce expenses, he came steerage in company with the rough seamen and wharf labourers and people like that, with the common people. That's all right. He saved money. He said, if I had 1,000 lives, I would give them to China. If I had 1,000 pounds, I would give it to China. He said, no, not China. I would give them to the Lord. That was the sort of man that the young family in Bundaberg began to associate with. Their Christian roots went back further than that, as we'll see in just a moment. So Hudson Taylor stayed with the Youngs in Bundaberg in 1890. This is a little bit before the convention began. A little bit older, Ernest Young and Margaret Young, the founders of the convention, Plymouth Brethren, and they visited Plymouth, their spiritual home, you might say, on their honeymoon in 1891. Now, Katoomba, when the railway went through, was a fettler's camp. The nice places to go in the mountains in the 1870s were Medlow Bath and Mount Victoria. Blackheath was too cold. Katoomba, there was a coal mine there, so nobody stopped at that dirty place. How different. There's the coal mine. Now, this is a drawing done from a photograph, and the photograph is rather dull by comparison with this. There's a man called John Britty North, bought the whole of the escarpment, and his idea was to run it as a coal mine. Look at that, isn't it amazing? Somewhat exaggerated. Orphan Rock isn't quite like that, but the railway line is still there. And in the early 20th century, people, as the tracks opened up in the valley beneath, they'd arrive at the bottom of the scenic railway, and they begged to be allowed to ride in a coal skip up to the top to save their weary legs. So, this is the first scenic railway. There it is, I think, in 1936, yes. It was called the Mountain Devil. That is about as close as the devil got to the Katoomba Convention. That wouldn't pass our H&S requirements, no, would it? Not by any means. It cost sixpence. The charges have gone up somewhat. So, in the mid-1890s, Margaret Young was looking for a holiday place because her first son was a frail boy. That's Dorothy Wheeler's father, Henry. Where's Dorothy, by the way? Terrific. So he survived to have two families, so the frail child survived. His mother bought a most lovely block of land right on the edge of the escarpment, and then her husband came down from Bundaberg to take a look at it. He said it reminds me so much of Kandala in India, where 25 years before, his elderly father, going to England with his son Ernest, stopped off at Bombay, went up to the hills behind, and went to Kandala. This, said Henry, is where I shot my first tiger. It makes you wonder, how many tigers did Henry Young shoot? Where are the tiger skins now? I don't think we've got any. Do you have any, Dorothy? No tiger skins? Well, they have disappeared along with the tigers. But it's striking how very similar Kandala, India was with Mount Solitary. Much later, the Youngs discovered that Kandala let's give its correct pronunciation, Kandala, House of God. And so the house Kandala became in a very real sense the House of God. This is a bit later. They're about 1915 at this stage. It's a good studio portrait, I think, taken for their son Henry to have with him when he went to fight in the First World War. Somewhat later. Let's come to Katoomba. Here it is in 1914. That's a 1914 street map. And you can see the station at the north. And then Katoomba Street, you know, where the Paragon Cafe is with its world-famous chocolates. You go right to the end, right down towards the cliff line, and that is where Kandala is, shown by the red arrow. Further over, where the present convention site is, there wasn't even a road. Cliff Avenue was built in the 1920s. Now, Ernest Young's sister, Emily Baring Dick, thought, well, she'd buy a little bit of property up there, and over a period of many years, she added one little block to another little block and built a house called Culverden, and they used to go up there for holidays together. And so that is now the present convention site, and I'll come to that in due course. You can see where the scenic railway now runs. All of that was very primitive, very undeveloped, even as late as 1914. So, at the end of the 1890s, the Youngs built a holiday home there, designed by John Silman, later Sir John Silman, the famous architect. Not like the grand mansions of the super wealthy down at Barrel and Sutton Forest and Burradoo. That's where the big money went. That's where the fashionable set went. This was just a quiet little place. It's not big, it still exists. It was in family ownership until about 5 years ago. Henry Young's one of the boys in the pictures there, in the picture there. Now, what happened is this. Like many 19th century Christian families, the Youngs always had daily prayers and Bible reading after breakfast. They're very hospitable people. We saw Hudson Taylor at Bundaberg. At Katoomba, they had befriended two people, John Sally, who was the travelling secretary of the China Inland Mission in Australia, and Nathaniel Jones, described by Margaret Young in her memoirs as the very saintly of a nearby theological college, which she doesn't name, but can't be anybody else. It's Nathaniel Jones. Those two became the first speakers at the Katoomba Convention, and at Church St Hilda's Katoomba, they were Brethren people, but they went to the Anglican Church. Other people said, can we please come and listen to the Bible studies by these two eminent Bible teachers? Says yes. And so in the children's playroom on the right there was the first convention in January 1903, with that magnificent view. You see the Keswick experience at work here. The fresh air of the mountains, the lovely view, That picture was taken at Kandala. This picture was taken nearby, and it comes from the convention proceedings of 1932. Occasionally they published a book about it. So here it is. The three sisters are quite marvellous in silhouette, aren't they? Now, for a few years, they published something called The Delectable Mountains. I'm going to read a little bit here. And 1905, 1910, 1911, thereabouts, an annual publication called The Delectable Mountains was issued about the convention for that January. No copies have survived. I didn't find any in 1903. The internet is far more widespread and far more permeating now. There is still nothing about those publications. They haven't survived. But where does it come from? It comes, of course, from Pilgrim's Progress, Bunyan. Not far from the celestial city, Christian and his companion Hopeful came to the Delectable Mountains, having escaped from the dungeon of the giant Despair. Bunyan tells his reader that there were on the tops of those mountains shepherds tending their flocks. The weary pilgrims asked, "Whose delectable mountains are these, and whose be the sheep that feed upon them?" The shepherds replied, "These mountains are Emmanuel's land. They are within sight of his city, and he laid down his life for them." Bunyan writes of the Delectable Mountains as a place where hospitality was extended most warmly and willingly. Now this had always been true of Margaret and Ernest's home in Bundaberg. Still more would be true of their lovely summer residence, to which Bunyan's familiar words seemed to apply in exact detail. Bunyan was speaking directly to Ernest and Margaret when he wrote that the shepherds told Christian and Hopeful, "The Lord of these mountains hath given us a charge not to be forgetful, to entertain strangers. Therefore the good of the place is before you." So that's Southey, Home Secretary of the CIM, and Nathaniel Jones, who had an enormous impact. Both men were very, very much influenced by the Grub mission, as was his Emily Deck in particular. Now here's the second convention, 1904. I'm going to dwell on this picture a bit, so it's very, very revealing. You can see Kandala's behind. Now, there's a car on the right. It's Henry Young's first car. That's not that particular example of it, which is rather superb, must be worth a great deal of money these days. It's a de Deal Bouton. All the early cars in Australia were French. The first car, in fact, was brought to Australia for the Easter show in the year 1900. So here we are, 4 years later, Henry's got a car. Ernest has a car. Now, those early cars were built with a one-cylinder engine. Not much power. It was rated at 6 horsepower, but that was very, very optimistic. So it was built for the flat streets of Paris. So Ernest invited one of the speakers, the Reverend Hugh Payton, up to Kandala. "You don't have to come by train, you can come in my car." Along with his eldest son, Henry, who was 8. Much later, Payton recalled that every time they came to a hill, Ernest, of course, was driving and steering the car, and little Henry, 8, and Hugh Payton had to get out and push up every hill. How many hills are there between Emu Plains and Katoomba? Now, another one in the picture that I'll come back to in a moment is Florence Young. Now, if you think of the maiden lady, the younger sister of rather successful brothers, and she had 3 very successful elder brothers, she's the younger sister. You'd think she might be a quiet, retiring person with not much to say for herself and never listened to. If you think of the total antithesis of this, was Florence Young. In 1882, she established what was called the Queensland Kanaka Mission. The workers on their brother's sugar plantation, Fairymead at Bundaberg, had been indentured from the Solomon Islands. Now, this is not the blackbirding period, which was close to slavery. That had finished by the time the Youngs went to Bundaberg. Make no mistake about that. They were not the blackbirders who were virtually slave owners. That was not the Youngs. That was earlier. They were not evangelized. So Florence started teaching them the Bible on Sunday afternoons. It was the day off, of course, of Christian family. And on the homestead veranda, she would have a Bible class. Out of that grew the Queensland Kanaka Mission. It was the first Brethren mission to the heathen. It was enormously successful. So much so that the neighbouring owners of plantations asked for missionaries from the QKM to go to their plantations because it made the workers work better, more profitable for the owners. Not a very good reason to have no missions. There it is. In 1904, it was announced by the government that all the Kanakas would be sent back to the Solomon Islands by 1906. They gave them a 2-year opportunity window to change their labour, which meant that white men would then have to work in the cane fields. And that was revolutionary. It was thought that whites couldn't do that. So what Florence did at the mission in 1904, she did 2 things. First, she invited 8 of the Christian leaders of the Queensland Kanaka Mission. You can bet she paid for their suits. Just think of it. The height of summer, but I mean, they wore 3-piece suits right up to the 1940s at Katoomba. That's what was done. Now notice, the government had just said, and the prevailing Australian climate was, these people are black, we can't have them in Australia. What does Florence do? All one in Christ Jesus. They're in the middle. There she is. Just in front of her in that enormous hat is Margaret, and Ernest is next to her on her right, our left. Thomas Sandwich, a few years later, was clubbed to death 3 days after he landed at Rennell Islands to start a mission there. Probably the first martyr of the South Sea Evangelical Mission. So the Queensland Kanaka Mission came to an end. It was succeeded by the South Sea Evangelical Mission, and the Katoomba Convention gave enormous support to the China Inland Mission and to the South Sea Evangelical Mission for a great many years. This is such a powerful picture. Completely countercultural. The country was against the blacks. She put them in the middle. All one in Christ Jesus. Now they outgrew the playroom very, very quickly. So, first of all, a tent was put up on the croquet lawn, and then that was too small, and then a much bigger tent was put up on the tennis court. You can see the tennis net. Now, the young man there, Richard Robinson, later became one of the great figures of the Katoomba Convention, and of course he, by the way, was one of the converts of the Grub Mission. I'm going to come back to Mr. Dibley later, but he's there in the front. He was the treasurer of the CIM, and he looked after the money side of things of the Katoomba Convention for something like 4 decades. Come back to him. There it is again, getting bigger. And we know this is 1910 because Margaret Young isn't there. She's having a baby. And so the Katoomba Convention wasn't held at Kandala that year. So her baby, Geoffrey Young, was born at Kandala, and many, many years later, my wife Patricia was born there too, in the same house. But this is a gathering, mainly a family gathering, at Govert's Leap. Now look at the way they're dressed. Bear in mind that it's only the well-to-do who have holidays. They don't have cars. Ernest had a car. They're all travelling up there by train. But they've got the time off, and they can afford to pay a guest house for a week's accommodation. Later, young men would stay in a bush camp. And it wasn't just expensive hotels, there were cheaper guest houses also. The convention, over a period of time, broadened its appeal. By this time, Ernest had a new car. I couldn't help putting it in. My father-in-law, Geoffrey, said, "This was the first car I ever drove." Now, leap forward pretty much a generation. Not many records survive for the next, say, 20 years or so. Ernest died in 1927. Margaret remained the hostess of the convention for another 15 years. Now, you can see all the heavies of the Anglican Church and some evangelical Presbyterians and Methodists and Presbyterians, but international. Bear in mind that the convention never set itself up as a separate church. They did not do what the Methodists had been forced to do in the 18th century. They didn't do what the Salvation Army did and the Plymouth Brethren did in the 19th century. They were always there to support and strengthen Bible-believing Christian churches. That's the details of the previous picture. You can see how Archbishop Mole almost defers to Mrs. Young. She was the hostess. She was more than the hostess, she was the matriarch. Bishop Robinson, Don Robbie, told me when I interviewed him quite some years ago for the history, he said, "We all called her Aunt Maggie," behind her back. Now, you think of the rather severe portrait of Archbishop Mole in Lober House. And here's Archbishop Mole, genial, on holiday, with Mrs. Young as his hostess. Every now and again he would take a bit of time off during his busy career as Archbishop. She lived at Tarramara. He would drive up to Tarramara. And they would play a game of chess. "Good morning, Pearl." That was her nickname. She published 2 volumes of memoirs under the pseudonym Pearl. "Good morning, Pearl." They'd play a game of chess. He always took care to make sure that she won. Here's a small range of some of the great leaders of that time. Archdeacon Begbie, another Melbourne man, convert at the Grub Mission, trained under Nathaniel Jones, and he and others became great figures in the Katoomba Convention, in the Anglican Church, and it goes through to the 3rd and 4th generation. Principal Morley. And of course the title Principal Morley, I can see somebody doing this. We all have our habits. Principal Morley, the title Principal instead of Mr. Morley or the Reverend Morley or his first names weren't used. It reflected the authority and respect, the authority he possessed and the respect in which he was held for 40 years as the leading Baptist clergyman and principal in Australia. Major figure in the convention. Robbie, in later years, a truly outstanding man. And Marcus Sloane said, when I interviewed him, Robbie had an instinct for sound theology, and that became important at a critical time. Don't need to introduce him, but I'm sure you haven't seen this photo before. The young Marcus Sloane spoke at Kandala in the late 1930s. Then they had a temporary site on Foster Road nearby, and then from 1955 on, he became a speaker at what is now the convention site. And he gave, I'll go back to Marcus Sloane for just a moment. the early convention meetings, a bit like a Brethren assembly, where the Spirit moved a person to get up and he would then, as the Spirit moved him, speak. So the convention did that. So the speaker would just speak as the Spirit moved him. There was no cohesion. And if they happened to speak on the same thing, well, that's that. Now, it became a little bit scrappy. It worried Marcus Sloane. So as a member of the council, he put together the idea of a plan for the week. The missionary day was tremendously important. That, of course, was retained. But he had a whole scheme which had to do with the idea of enriching the Christian life. And that remains to the present. It's Marcus Sloane's abiding imprint on the convention. Now, Hammond came as principal of Moore College. He came at a very critical time, and if we have time for questions later, I might go into that a bit more. Now, Dr. Guinness, he was very particular. He wasn't the Reverend Doctor in a medical degree. He was Dr. the Reverend Howard Guinness. So his memoirs, Journey Among Students, tell how in January 1930 he arrived in Sydney, was met, and he was immediately motored up to Katoomba to see Mrs. Young, because the convention was on and he had this magnificent reputation, and he was set to work amongst the young men of the convention. Within 2 years, the Crusader Union had been established, and the Sydney University Evangelical Union had been established. Then you did the same in Melbourne and in Perth, I think in Adelaide. You'll notice he's wearing a Crusader badge. I put my Crusader badge on this morning too. Back in the 1950s, the leaving certificate was quite straightforward. The tough one was writing your statement of why you wanted a Crusader badge, and what belief and Christian practice would you put the Crusader badge to. So the Crusader badge was a very big thing, and your application went to the Crusader Council for consideration. Then you got a letter back to say you'd been awarded, and that was great. So he founded the Crusaders. He came once. Bishop Taylor Smith had been a chaplain to the Queen, which is why he got his knighthood in the Royal Victorian Order. The Queen Victoria. So he died, in fact, in 1938, a few weeks after the convention, on the way back to Sydney, way back from Sydney to England. But he had an enormous impact by his writings, his tremendous spirituality. Now, Hammond had dealt with the whole sinless perfection movement. The desire for holiness could lead people into extremes, as it has done over the centuries. And that surfaced in Sydney at the end of the 30s, the beginning of the 40s. Not at the Katoomba Convention. Hammond kept it out. Not at Moore College. Hammond kept it out. You'll remember his series of addresses on the Book of Romans, which he did from time to time over a period of more than 20 years. And using the Book of Romans, he proved how necessary it was for the Holy Spirit to dwell in the heart of the believer. He was being motored, driven, on the missionary afternoon. It was raining. And the windscreen wiper was going. Taylor Smith had a marvellous knack of taking the moment and applying a spiritual truth to it. And in the rain with the windscreen wipers, Taylor Smith waved his hand to and fro. He said, "The blood of Jesus cleanses and keeps on cleansing us from every sin." When he died, Archbishop Mole was so impressed with the impact he'd made that he had a large memorial tablet erected in St Andrew's Cathedral. You can see it to this day. Taylor Smith. Now, the convention never kept records of finances or attendances. The figure comes from the Sydney Morning Herald, and this picture was published in the Sydney Morning Herald. Don Robbie said, "I was in that crowd." We looked for him, and he's lost in the crowd of 800 people. But if you take a look, don't know who the little boy is on the left, But it's all the convention heavies in the front row with one exception. You'll see the Archbishop standing just behind. Now the Archbishop happens to be just behind, I do not know. But Margaret Young has grabbed T.C. Hammond and brought him to the front, because he was the man of the hour theologically at that time. He was very much needed. And you find on the right, much older, Mr. Dibley. I was able to find, to my delight a few days ago, a picture of him on the internet. And it's very much him with his wife and his daughter. Now, what did he do with the convention? He didn't speak. He was the treasurer of several Christian organizations, a very good organizer. Think of the number of organizations which we have had connections with over the years, secular, Christian, of all kinds, where somebody has worked faithfully and long, very quietly behind the scenes to make sure that the machinery runs superbly well. So you can think of probably 10 or 20, 30 or 40, 50 Mr. Dibleys. When he died, although they couldn't really afford it, they put up the Dibley Memorial Gates. They're still there. And if you pass them on the drive on the way up, they're always kept open these days, but it does have the Dibley Memorial Gates. Put them together and you see the whole thing. Who was Dibley? Now you know. Because there was no plaque put up. Why not? Oh, everybody knows Mr. Dibley. But that was 70 years ago. Mr. Dibley. Now, carefully, children of the program. There are some people here who were possibly there in the 1950s. Now, what chorus are they singing? See it? High as the heavens above. The deeper sea is my Saviour's love. Okay, we'll stop. It was a good excuse to poke the neighbouring child in the face. Now, Mrs. Young let it be known in 1941 that she was getting on in years. She really needed to move on from Kandala, and the convention needed to move on too. The convention council said, would you like to give us the convention site, please? Give us Kandala. Well, that was just asking a bit much. So what happened is that they bought 2 or 3 blocks of land nearby, a place called Foster Road. There it's being cleared. Somebody thought to have a camera, which is amazing. And the conventions were held there for about 13, 14, 15 years. Marcus Sloan being one of the speakers. No parking problem in those days. It was quite obviously inadequate. The site was too small, no view, problems with the local council about the toilet block, not up to scratch, drainage problems. It was all difficult. And the Deck family, these are the descendants of Emily Baring Deck, who's Ernest's young sister. She had acquired over a period of years 19 acres. That's the appeal brochure. Go back to that old map, and this time we'll come to, the other detailed map, but you can see at that page where Emily Deck bought her land right on the edge of the cliff. There was no road, it was out of town, and nobody worried about it. She just wanted a bush retreat. But in the early to mid-50s, the Deck family got together, especially the grandsons who'd been away at the war, they came back, and they decided that there was no real point in trying to keep that big property. What good use could they find for it? So one thing led to another. In 1955, the Katoomba Convention, for the first time, was incorporated as a body corporate and took over title of what is now the convention site. Let's turn to a new generation of outstanding leaders. There's Alex Gilchrist. I think we have his daughter here. Don't we owe so much to those who've gone before? Alex Gilchrist, key man, absolutely key man, in the acquisition of the convention site and building it up to what it is today. I can see a Morris Minor. I can see an Austin 7. I can see an old pre-war car. I don't see an F.J. Holden, funnily enough. It's got to be there somewhere. There's a Zephyr, yes, a Ford Zephyr. Let's take a look afterwards, see if we can name them all. So here is the first stage of the present auditorium going in. It's big for those days. The people who worked so hard on that thought in terms of a future where the Lord would continue to bless. Canon Begbie, son, of course, of Archdeacon Herbert Begbie, convention chairman for 20 years. Ron Trout. Is Ruth here? Ruth Bunn's father. Outstanding practical leader of the 1950s and 1960s. I would say the same about Eric Norgate. Now they're the three key people, well there are others of course, but they're three of the key people of leadership in the 50s and 60s. Now here's Ron Trowell's picture of the completed auditorium. The product of his drive and vision, his determination to get things done, and probably above all, his capacity to enthuse others, to make sure that the vision was achieved. Wonderful men. But, if you take a look, it's not a big crowd anymore. Where are the young people? What happened was this. The convention was still meeting just after Christmas, as it always had done. Under Jeff Fletcher, the CMS Summer School was attracting a lot of young people. You may recall an enormous convention in the Sydney Town Hall in 1958. I was there, a lot of you would have been there too, and the chair was taken by Bishop Marcus Loam. He had just been consecrated bishop. Remember him saying he didn't want to disappoint those who thought that he was wearing an Elvis Presley shirt. They're going to the summer school. They're going to beach missions as leaders of Crusader Camp. And the convention needed a new direction and a different style. John Reed had been on the council for some time. He became chairman in 1971. And I said to John when I interviewed him in 2003, I said, was the convention's existence a threat? He said, Stuart, it was touch and go. They'd been losing money for some time. The old idea was you didn't ask for money. You certainly didn't charge admission. And in the 1920s and before, up to Ernest Young's death, if there was a shortfall in finances, Ernest Young would write a cheque. In the 1930s, I think probably Margaret Young did the same. You didn't worry about money, you didn't talk about money. Sure, there was a big tea chest or something for people who might want to donate, but if there was a shortfall, that was different. You didn't ask. You did have a missionary offering. And in 1940, with the war on, there was the most magnificent missionary day, and £2,000 was given. Just think of it. A professional man's salary, a good professional salary in those days was £500. £2,000 was given on missionary day. But the finances were problematic. And by the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, it was a knife-edge situation for the convention. John Reed had the capacity of choosing the right man at the right time. Chapo, with his amazing gift for evangelism, especially youth evangelism, and Philip Jensen, dynamic, youthful, energetic, got on wonderfully well with a group of people around him who thought as he did and worked as he did. And the results were amazing. Extensions were put in the 1990s. I don't know too much about OH&S rules, but they did it. They were able to secure the rental of Clairvaux Oval Catholic School nearby, had closed down in the early 1960s, been acquired by, I think, the Department of Youth and Community Services, who led them, is that right, Graham?
Yes.
Yes. Who allowed them to have use of the Oval. And there was, in 1988, erected the biggest tent in Australia. Graham told me that, I think it was that year or the next year, they nearly lost it in a storm. He spent 3 very worrying days trying to get it up. They got it up in the end. But the neighbourhood was up in arms because all the cars parked on the roads for a considerable distance around. There were letters to the local papers, so that couldn't survive. You couldn't get insurance for a crowd of 6,000 people under that tent, quite apart from the logistics of getting out. You couldn't insure it. Is that right, Graham? Yes. Yes. So it couldn't last. It couldn't last. So in subsequent years, another great leader, it's so lovely to put these pictures up. So what we had was big extensions to the grounds, varied program. 6 conventions were developed at various times in the year for various strategically placed audiences. Here's Kickstart, Katoomba Youth Convention, Kickstart. Superb leadership, good singing, good missionary meetings. The young people came back in droves with their families. And different ideas. Here's 2008, the title of one of the conventions. Burn Your Plastic, Jesus. I can't imagine Nathaniel Jones thinking of a title like that. All rather different. But you see, the convention had to reinvent itself 2 or 3 times. When I interviewed Philip Jensen, he said, of course, the convention will have to keep reinventing itself to meet the needs of a new generation. The style of the original convention had to change by the 1930s. It had to change again in the 1970s. And the convention keeps its finger on the pulse of just where the need is in a very rapidly changing world. Burn Your Plastic, Jesus, isn't it marvellous? Now let's go back at one. So the original motto of Keswick, 1875, of Florence Young putting her South Sea Island men, they were called boys in those days with a capital B. Now that racist, demeaning language has gone. I met one of the pastors of the South Sea Evangelical Church some years ago, showed me the photo. He was delighted. He was able to name 7 out of the 8 of the founders of that church. I said, why Thomas Sandwich? He said, well, he didn't come from the Solomon Islands, he came from the Sandwich Islands. So they called him Thomas Sandwich. So there's the full text. Neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. There they are. Recently, same view. They've gone round to Echo Point, with Narrowneck on the right, Mount Saltram on the left, and the vastness of the Jamson Valley in the foreground. In that sense, nothing has changed. The convention remains true to its original foundation. It is there for the deepening of the spiritual life, was the phrase they used for so long. We wouldn't use that phrase now. We might say enrichment. We might say preaching, as the Convention Council chose the title of the book there, A Centre of Preaching Christ. All of those things remain true then as they do now. Thank you very much.